Hello everyone and welcome to the very first episode of the CANZUK Now podcast, hosted by me, the Blazing Redcoat, and the idea of this podcast is to consolidate and bring together all the CANZUK news and updates of the last 2 weeks or the last month or so on a recurring basis. And I want to especially shout out user Drew Patterson, who very kindly sent a super chat donation with this podcast suggestion. So I hope you enjoy. This is my first foray into more improvised long-form content, so I hope you enjoy and stick with me, and let's get into some of this CANZUK news. Now, first off, I do want to do a quick rundown on what CANZUK actually is for those tuning in for the first time or who are not too aware. So CANZUK is an acronym using the first letters of Canada, Australia, New Zealand and the United Kingdom, and is a proposed union or alliance between these Commonwealth nations, particularly focusing on freedom of movement, free trade, a coordinated foreign policy and a united diplomatic voice in world affairs. I've discussed many different aspects of CANZUK and its possibilities, economically, culturally, militarily, on my YouTube channel before, so do check those out if you want some more context. Overall, it's a very exciting prospect for these countries. I also wanted to do a quick reminder at the beginning of the podcast here for anyone living in the UK who is either a UK citizen, a British citizen, or is just resident in the UK living there, you can sign the UK petition for starting talks on a CANZUK union. This is really, really important. It is close to the 10,000 signatures needed for it to receive a formal response from the UK government, but the deadline is right around the corner. So if you haven't already signed it, I'll put the QR code up on the screen now, or you can also use the link in the description to go and do so. It takes you to the UK Parliament website. It's really quick and easy to do. You just click sign. As I say, you have to be a British citizen or living in the UK to be eligible. You fill in a few details and then your email to get updates on the petition, or the progress of the petition in the future, and that is it. So please help us get over this final hurdle of that 10,000 and get some government attention on this issue. There is also now a Canadian petition that has already received a great number, over 1,000 signatures in just a couple of weeks, and I believe the Canadian government will now be obligated to take notice of this one too, which is amazing, and I will talk a bit more about this later as well, going into the detail about what type of CANZUK and things included in it that petition proposes. I'll go into some more detail on that. So, CANZUK news. I'll be going through quite a few articles and updates in this podcast, and I think a good place to recap on first would be Canada hosting the G7. The British Prime Minister, of course, attended this, being a member of the G7, and the Australian Prime Minister was also invited along. It was hosted in Ottawa, this forum, and the Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, who recently, along with the Australian Prime Minister, won remarkable turnaround victories for their parties due to the Trump effect, essentially, had some very warm words for them, talking of the historic and enduring ties with the UK, wanting to further strengthen these ties and build upon the partnership that keeps our nation safe and our economies strong. And in a moment, I'll have a little discussion about what action was actually taken at the G7, what we actually got out of this forum, other than friendly words, essentially. Anthony Albanese, the Australian PM, had actually stopped by Fiji ahead of attending the G7, and he said that Australia will always be a reliable partner and will work with world leaders on issues that matter: climate change, energy security, and free, fair trade. Now, one of the main discussions that seems to be happening between CANZUK nations at the moment is how they can increase free trade. This seems to be the first step we are taking, and this is particularly important for Canada. I've discussed this geopolitical aspect before. With an increasingly hostile United States across the border from Canada, I do think it is imperative for Ottawa to diversify its trading relationships, which for a while have been heavily focused, of course, on the US market. The Canadians export a lot to the US, and this is actually where a lot of the White House and President Trump's rhetoric originates from, because Americans essentially love buying Canadian goods. Canada exports a lot to the US, and for Trump, for some unknown reason, he sees this as America subsidizing Canada, when all it is a freedom of trade corridor, and Americans just love Canadian goods, and there's a free flow of trade between the two countries. And these tariffs that are meant to be coming soon would have really negative impacts. For example, if you are a lobster farmer in the state of Maine, those lobsters go across the Canadian border to be processed. They'll slap a 50% tariff on them there, or 25%, or whatever it's going to be. Then they get processed in Canada and they get sent back across the border back into Maine, where they'll have to pay another 25 or 50% or however much on the lobster coming back in. And by the time that is ready to be sent to consumers, there is going to be a massive increase in lobster prices for the citizens of Maine, and this is what drives their economy there. So that's just one example of how it's going to be it's a really stupid idea. So yes, that's a roundabout way of saying that it is really good for Canada to be diversifying its trading relationships. And at the time of writing and recording this podcast, President Trump has said he is cutting off trade talks with Canada immediately, as Canada looks to start enforcing a new tax policy targeting big tech companies. So no surprise that Trump doesn't want his billionaire buddies to be paying any more tax, so is trying to cut off the talks to force Canada to reverse on this policy. The two were trying to reach a trade deal by mid-July and have imposed tariffs on each other's goods after Trump sparked that trade war earlier in the year and has threatened to annex Canada using economic force. So a great betrayal of the US-Canada relationship. There have been absolutely best of friends for decades, and just like that, Trump has thrown it down the pan. He said he was ending talks due to what he called an egregious tax on tech companies, and with all the corruption that's in the White House at the moment, I am not surprised by this news. Washington's hostile rhetoric is, in a well-established system of civilized relationships and dialogues, quite vile to me, to be honest, and the instability that it has been bringing to global geopolitics in just the last 6 months is crazy. Fawning over dictators like Putin as well, disrupting the global economic system, and instead of consolidating US power in the international system, has further accelerated the shift towards multipolarity, or a multipolar system, and this is something that I've mentioned before as well. A multipolar system is one which there are a number of regional powers all around the world. So for example, an American sphere of influence, Chinese, European Union, and possibly CANZUK in the future would be another sphere of this multipolar system. And as anyone who has studied this system will know, or geopolitics will know, it is one of the most unstable global systems out there. So I'm glad that Canada is shifting away from such an unreliable partner, and it does seem like some progress was made at the G7, not just words, between non-US countries, that is. There was no real breakthrough on the ridiculous tariff situation, and President Trump obviously left early as well, supposedly to focus on the Iran conflict, but we all know his disdain for international structures and fora, so there was no surprise that he just waltzed out of there. And the Australian Prime Minister didn't actually get a meeting with Trump because he left early. The only thing that really stood out was the signing of the US-UK trade deal, which was announced back in May, and then Trump dropped it on the ground. You can't really write it really, but upon his exit, Trump said, "We're actually finished with every deal if you think about it," indicating that he even felt the discussions were little more than formalities. So as I say, his disdain is clear to see. So the G7 is essentially now a G6 plus one, I guess. In terms of the CANZUK aspect of it though, CANZUK-wise, Keir Starmer and Mark Carney had a couple of meetings, including a private dinner and a full bilateral meeting, and spoke about slashing trade barriers between the two countries, kind of getting the ball rolling again on trade talks that fell apart back in January 2024 over hormone-fed beef, which is perfectly fine in Canada, but does not live up to the food standards over in the UK, which we have mostly got from the European Union, but in some cases the UK actually goes even further than the EU on the quality of food aspect during the import process. So they fell apart over hormone-fed beef, but Canada has now agreed to ratify Britain's accession to the massive Pacific Rim Trade Pact, the CPTPP, which means that the two countries can now trade under the terms of that agreement as they push for closer commercial ties amid Washington's tariff war. Of course, Britain has been a member of this pact, the CPTPP, for a couple of years now, but Canada has so far refused to ratify it over the issue of the beef, and this meant that the two countries couldn't trade under the terms of the agreement, but now they can, so that's really good and will hopefully be the spark that relights trade talks between them. They also agreed to launch a joint task force to make progress on areas including technology and artificial intelligence, which is a really fascinating development and something I am going to look deeper into and see if there's anything that I can pick out for the next podcast. The task force will also look to make progress on the wider UK-Canada Free Trade Agreement, although a UK official did tell Politico it's more of a staging post towards relaunching and whether we think it's possible to get there within our red lines. So small steps at the moment, but very crucial I think to get these snags and barriers out the way first before much more progress can then be made. And I think the CPTPP is a bit of a tongue twister, that one. The CPTPP, whose members have nearly $16 trillion of GDP combined, could be a really useful way actually for CANZUK nations to collectively further trade relationships using that as the baseline and kind of building upon those existing relationships they have in this Pacific Trade Organization already. All four are members after all. Now, Keir Starmer and Mark Carney also released a joint statement during the G7 saying that they reaffirm the profound friendship and shared values that unite both nations. The Canada-UK partnership, they say, is rooted in a common history and enduring people-to-people ties that continue to grow stronger and with a focus on delivering prosperity and security for the working people of Canada and the UK alike. So more of that kind of rhetoric, the collective history, the collective culture, working together to further the prosperity of our people, which is all good in words and in writing, and hopefully it will appear in actions as well. The two leaders discussed the many geopolitical challenges currently facing the world, and no doubt Trump came up in that a lot, and included in that was also they mentioned the Middle East and tensions in the Indo-Pacific region as well, so China, and reaffirmed their steadfast support for Ukraine in the face of Russia's illegal and unjustifiable war of aggression. And I think Canada is looking to get closer to Europe on many issues as well. The two leaders, they say, also underscored the importance of fair, open and predictable global trading systems, and that is a very direct message to Trump. Fair, open and predictable global trading system, because Donald Trump is effectively the opposite of all of those things. It's unfair. He wants to bias it against all countries based on his belief of what the trade imbalance is, even though it's literally just bilateral trade. And then open, Donald Trump wants to be protectionist and shut America off and whack tariffs on everyone. And predictable, Donald Trump is the opposite of predictable. I don't think I have to explain that one. They also reiterated their commitment to a rules-based international order underpinned by respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, and committed to advancing peace and transatlantic security. And they agreed a number of joint initiatives aimed at strengthening economic growth and prosperity and enhancing collective security and defence. I do think we hear a lot of these talking points a lot from our government, which is obviously to be expected, but I always hope that something kind of concrete, something more tangible actually comes from all these words. Maybe I'm too optimistic, but for me, I feel like we need to really get this going before the opportunity fades. And I do think the United States has damaged its reputation under Trump and is no longer a reliable ally. And we need to really get closer to nations that we can trust as reliable allies, shared history, shared head of state, shared political system, and shared, essentially, we're the same people, just in different parts of the world. And this is something that I think is really important, and why the petition is so important as well, as sometimes it can be frustrating to get the government to notice initiatives like this and to notice what the people actually are thinking. So also keep contacting your local MPs as well and see if they will push this forward too. Regarding the Australian Prime Minister Albanese's trip to the G7, which of course Australia isn't a member of the G7, but he was invited along as a key partner, I couldn't find all that much of what Albanese got up to, but of course he also received a very warm welcome and held bilateral talks with Carney as well. Now, Albo has talked about diversifying energy sources as he was there and strengthening critical minerals supply, which Australia is very key with, and the chain tons of those supplies, so his participation seemed to focus mainly on global energy security at the G7 rather than on bilateral trade talks or trilateral with UK and Canada, etc. But he also focused on and discussed tech and AI, which was a sort of a running theme in the background of the G7 and definitely a fascinating subject to keep up with going forward, as it will only become more prevalent. Now, perhaps the most notable is the mutual gratitude between Canada and Australia helping each other out with bushfires, with G7 members endorsing a new wildfire charter. Australian and Canadian firefighters already regularly travel across seas to support each other during each of their respective fire seasons, with Australia deploying nearly 100 personnel to Canada in May and June this year to assist with their recent wildfires. So overall, the G7, while not really significant in pushing forward anything with global trade flows, with Donald Trump leaving early and pretty unwavering on his policies, there were some small victories between the CANZUK nations and other European nations that were there, and kind of non-US partners reaffirming their commitment to free trade, international organizations, the rule of law, and the rules-based international system as a whole. And it was definitely a good thing that the UK and Canada look to be ramping up trade talks again, which is a crucial part and perhaps the most important underlying part of any potential CANZUK alliance, because I do think if there is a pre-existing trade bloc between the four countries, it is then a lot easier to build upon that with further structures. If they have a forum where they come together every year, say, to talk about their trade flows with each other, just the four countries, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, then I think that also can be a forum that they use to build upon that to create a more strengthened CANZUK union. So that about covers what I wanted to discuss about the G7, because you read in the news some broad headlines about the G7, so I wanted to try and delve a bit deeper to pick out what can be relevant mostly for the CANZUK countries. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I want to now talk about that brand new CANZUK petition in Canada, E6585 it's called, to the Government of Canada, which went live on the 16th of June, so about 2 weeks ago as I'm recording this podcast, and the same time that the G7 was taking place. And this has already received some amazing support. I know CANZUK International made a blog post about it, and I've seen lots of people on the CANZUK subreddit also promoting this. So well done to the Canadians, because it has now already passed 1,000 signatures. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this and the vision for CANZUK that particular petition presents, because of course everyone has a different opinion and different version of CANZUK that they want to put forward, and this petition has a very interesting few points that I'll go over with you in a moment. The petition is sponsored by a Liberal member of the Canadian Parliament, so the same party as the Prime Minister, Mark Carney, which is a good sign. I know the Conservative Party of Canada also mentioned CANZUK in their manifesto for the recent election, but of course the Trump effect and Pierre Poilievre being presented as the Canadian kind of Trump, the Canadian version of Trump in that way, was also a big factor in the rejection of the Conservative Party of Canada at that particular election, and Mark Carney presenting himself as the candidate for a strong Canada, a free Canada, that sort of thing. That really resonated well with the Canadian population. So as I say, this is sponsored by a Liberal member of Parliament, and it's the MP for Etobicoke Centre in Ontario. I think that's how you pronounce it, but sorry if I butchered that pronunciation. It's, I think, Etobicoke Centre in Ontario, and calls upon the federal government of Canada to strengthen their relationships with Australia, New Zealand and the United Kingdom through CANZUK. It directly lists a number of crucial points on its webpage of the e-petition, which I will link to if you want to check it out, but the main things it says are, it says, whereas the American withdrawal from global affairs leaves Canada in a vulnerable position, and we must strengthen our other partnerships to face this reality. A pact between Canada, Australia, New Zealand and the United Kingdom, termed CANZUK, is now receiving support across the political spectrum. These countries are incredibly close allies, sharing a system of government through a common history and values that unite them across vast distances. Each of our governments cooperate closely through numerous global organisations such as the Commonwealth, CPTPP, Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, G7 and NATO. Our lands are incredibly resource rich and home to the most educated people in the world, numbering 140 million in total when counted together. We have built the most tolerant societies in the world, where diversity is our strength and visible minorities are trusted in the highest seats of power, and deepening ties based on clear compatibility can build a new pillar of the democratic world that could outdo our past reliance on the United States. So that is the broad context that the petition sets out, and I'll get into its suggestions in a moment, but I do think this lays out some really important points. It lays out the shared system of government, the common history, the common values that unite us all, which is a really key thing to point out, as well as the fact that our governments already cooperate very, very closely in several international organisations, and just the fact that we are such close peoples. I feel like, I'm British myself, of course, but I feel like there's such a sense of unity between all of our peoples. I feel a lot more close to the CANZUK nations than I feel about any European nation, for example, even though geographically we are a lot closer. And that is a very rare thing in this current global world, to be so far apart but be so united in how we feel about each other. It's almost like a brotherhood of nations, or a family of nations, things like that. But the petition lays out some key suggestions to the government of Canada after giving it that context. So what it says is, we, the undersigned citizens of Canada, call upon the government of Canada to, quote, enter negotiations for a CANZUK pact covering both labour mobility, so that freedom of movement idea to be able to live and work in each other's countries, and security to start, create a programme allowing university graduates to freely travel and work in each country, mutually recognising most professional qualifications in areas such as healthcare and engineering, which is a really key point, and I'll come on to that in a moment. 3. Recognise a long-term goal of free movement for all citizens. 4. Enhance security ties through mutual defence commitments and jointly developing military technology. And 5. Begin with joining British efforts for a 6th-generation fighter jet, which we are calling Tempest, rather than an American alternative. So the jet that the British are developing, I think alongside the Italians and perhaps the Japanese, actually is called the Tempest. It closes on the 14th of October, this petition, and has already reached over 1,000 signatures, meaning it has passed the threshold of 500. It's already doubled that threshold, and it will be certified now by the Clerk of Petitions, or clerk if you're North American, before being presented or tabled in the House of Commons, then sent to the Privy Council office, and then will receive a government response within 40 days of its presentation or tabling in the Commons. So this is a really positive development, a really great start, and great to know that we will actually get an official response to CANZUK itself from the government of Canada at some point in the near future. As for the version of CANZUK this petition presents, I think it's a really great first step. Of course, it doesn't go as deeply as I would like personally, but of course you can't expect such integration from the initial steps. I think especially the idea of the collective development of military technology not dependent on the United States is really positive, and actually something the European Union is already looking into, separating itself and being free to decide its own path on military development, not being reliant on the United States. I think President Macron of France has been very key in pushing that forward. But as well as opening the doors for free movement, this petition does say about those mutual recognition of qualifications. That is really, really important, because it means that any migration or labour flows between the countries can easily be based on positions that each country needs to fill in its labour forces. So it mentions here healthcare and engineering as two of the ones that can be the most important to begin with, and I think that's a really good idea to lay the groundwork for further free movement. And it does say recognise a long-term goal of free movement for all citizens in the future. So that's great, and I do think this is a reason to get excited about the future of CANZUK, and of course I will be sure to update you on any progress or response this petition receives. And to round out this very first episode of the CANZUK Now podcast, I wanted to go over a few smaller updates. First of all, a defence update. The New Zealand warship HMNZS, His Majesty's New Zealand ship, Te Kaha, Maori for the Force, Fresh from 2 months of security patrols, including drug-busting operations alongside the Royal Navy in the Indian Ocean, this ship has now joined the UK's Carrier Strike Group back on the 18th of June, which passed through the Suez Canal on the 12th of June and is now working with Britain's premier naval deployment of 2025. Together, they will learn crucial skills and get used to the ways of working with the multinational force led by HMS Prince of Wales, a Queen Elizabeth-class aircraft carrier, one of 2 in the UK. This group is heading into a new Asia-Pacific phase of its deployment, known as Operation High Mast, conducting a series of exercises with allies and partners in the region. And this is great to see and also helps to solidify the fact that all 4 of our armed forces have a great degree of interoperability, with forces travelling and training with each other. And back at the end of April, New Zealand actually reaffirmed its defence partnerships with the UK as well, with Prime Ministers Starmer and Luxon directing their defence ministers to develop a new framework, building on the one that we established in 2015, with the key highlight being the deployment of Kaha alongside the Carrier Strike Group. According to the Navy Lookout page, the group had arrived in Singapore and was there for a week or so, with Australian HMAS Sydney also there and joined the group as it departed on the 29th of June, heading to Australia to participate in the multilateral exercise Talisman Sabre from the 13th of July to the 4th of August. And according to that same page, exercise Talisman Sabre includes plans to launch 8 F-35Bs simultaneously for the first time in one of the high-end training serials. This exercise will provide an opportunity, they say, to integrate the UK jets with large force packages from air forces of allied nations in complex scenarios, before a port visit to Darwin and a departure then towards Japan and Korea. So another great example of the CANZUK militaries working really well together and seamlessly together as well, alongside other allied nations, of course. In that same vein of defence, I've also heard a lot recently about both Canada and the UK signing further military security and defence partnerships with the European Union, which, while not specifically CANZUK related, is something I thought I should mention in this podcast. Since if we are continuing to move away from a dependence on the United States, working further with European allies as a bloc, CANZUK as an entity working with the EU on these issues, I wouldn't be against. As I've mentioned, the UK is already working with Italy within the Tempest programme and Japan, of course, with them as well. So those are some positive developments in defence, but I know we can go further with CANZUK. In other news, CANZUK International posted about their welcoming of the Canadian Competition Bureau's aviation recommendations. And while that does sound quite wordy, I'll set a little bit of context here, as this new report is aimed at increasing competitiveness for the Canadian airline industry. And CANZUK International supported one particular policy proposal within this report, which concerned cabotage rights within aviation airspace. So what are cabotage rights? Well, these allow airlines to operate within the borders of another country, particularly to carry passengers or cargo directly from one location in country A to another location in country A, instead of that flight leaving that country. So say the Canadian Airlines could then use their planes and fly from one location in the UK to another in the UK, rather than having to leave and go back to Canada. The Canadian government currently has quite strict restrictions on these rights, which is why it was part of this new report. No action has been taken by the Canadian government yet, but it's just an advisory report which they could adopt all of these suggestions in. But they suggest that it would undoubtedly make, CANZUK International this is, it would suggest that they would undoubtedly make complete sense for Canada to consider partner countries such as the UK, Australia and New Zealand, given their exemplary records in aviation safety, security and commitment to competition. And CANZUK International also says this would help to increase competition in Canada, but also to result in lower ticket prices for Canadian consumers, and assume that would mean consumers in the other countries as well that they work with. They go on to say, as such, Canada could consider affording CANZUK airlines such as Air New Zealand, British Airways and Qantas the right to operate within domestic Canadian airspace, thereby providing greater route access for Canadian passengers, increasing competition and reducing fares. The same cabotage rights could be extended to Canadian airlines such as Air Canada and WestJet throughout Australia, New Zealand and the United Kingdom for a kind of vice versa effect. CANZUK International will also, they say, they will continue to work with relevant government ministries in Canada and Transport Canada to advocate for increased cabotage rights for CANZUK Airlines and support the recommendations of the Competition Bureau. So they're doing some really good work here, lobbying the Canadian government to adopt these recommendations. And hopefully that means that in the future it will be cheaper for all of us to travel around each other's countries. I also saw that the Canadian government greenlit Porter Airlines, which is based in Toronto, one of the Canadian airlines, to expand their services to fly to Caribbean countries such as Jamaica, but also to the UK, where Porter will now be able to use their own Embraer jets to land in the UK, whereas before they were only able to operate such flights through a joint venture with Air Transat, which will now allow for cheaper flights, say from Toronto to London Gatwick, than, for example, going through Air Canada from Ottawa to London Heathrow, for example. So another bit of positive news there. Always nice to have some extra options for travel between our two countries. And so that about wraps up what I wanted to talk about in this podcast. I really hope you've enjoyed tuning in for the inaugural episode of the CANZUK Now podcast, hosted by me, the Blazing Redcoat. And let me know any suggestions or constructive criticism you may have in this episode. I'm always, of course, looking for ways to improve the experience for you guys. If you did happen to enjoy it, please do like and subscribe if you're on YouTube, and follow along if you're on Spotify, and give it a rating. And as always, I will speak to you in the next one.